All right, welcome everyone to our first working, if you will, common session, our common session 1A. So we built in the last week's common session so that we could familiarize ourselves with this technology, especially the Google Hangout and the different Slack channels. Just a reminder that you should be in 2 Slack channels. One, the bigger group, and then you have small groups. So watch for, if you haven't joined 2 groups, you should be in 2. So with that said, we had a lot of fun. Let's do a little more, get a little more serious, but it's still going to be fun. We're going to talk about Herodotus Book 2, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Wadden, who's going to start, and Professor Sandridge will also be speaking tonight. Be sure to ask them questions as they talk in the Slack channel, and I'll relay questions when I can. And yeah, all right. Professor Wadden, you are on.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Okay, so we're here in Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina, and I'm not always great at multitasking, so I'll try and keep an eye on the questions coming in on the Slack, but I don't make any promises. Book 1 is wonderful, and it's huge, and it's got so many fabulous stories in it that, you know, we could speak just about Book 1 all semester and never run out of fun things to say. But instead of giving a kind of overview of the book, I thought I'd focus on one very small vignette, one short story that appears right at the very start of the book. So this is the story of Gyges in Book 1, chapters 6 to 13 or thereabouts. And as is often the case with Herodotus, he introduces this story as part of a longer story. So in Book 1, chapter 6, he introduces us to Croesus, the first barbarian to invade Greece. And if you like, we've spoken about this a bit here in Belmont Abbey, and Croesus, Herodotus tends to start a story, and then very shortly he adds in these huge tangential bits and pieces. So he starts telling us about Croesus, and then he goes off meandering around on this long story about Gyges, Croesus's great-great-great-grandfather. And it's great, and it starts, we'll just do maybe a quick recap for people who haven't had a chance to read it fully yet. Book 1, chapter 8 starts with that wonderful statement that King Candaules of Lydia fell in love with his wife, as if that's the strangest thing that ever happened, right? So this is the first weird bit of Herodotus. A man fell in love with his wife. He believes her to be the most beautiful woman in the world, and he tries to convince his bodyguard of this, and his bodyguard is Gyges. And Gyges believes him, but Candaules doesn't accept that. He says that in order for Gyges to believe, he has to see it for himself. So Candaules sneaks Gyges into the bedroom to see Candaules' wife undressing. She notices him, doesn't say anything at the time, but the next day she calls Gyges and she tells him that he had to either kill Candaules and take the kingship, or be killed himself, right? So this is all wonderful and mixed up, but it's great fun. Gyges does kill Candaules, he takes the kingship, and then his kingship is confirmed by an oracle. And it's the oracle that Herodotus is really interested in, because that says that after, in the 5th generation, the family would lose the kingship, and that's going to bring us back to Croesus. Now, another version of this story is repeated by Plato, right? And in Plato's version, there's a magic ring. Plato was heavily influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien, right? So there's a magic invisibility ring. So this is obviously a story that some other people knew about and was going around, but Herodotus chose to include it here. And I think it's really significant that he puts it right here, right at the very start of his book. Like I said, there is obviously this strong narrative purpose, right? It's very important to his story that he sets up this fall, this kind of awaited fall of Croesus. So it has that purpose, but I also think there's a more important purpose. The story here, in a way, it sets out exactly what Herodotus himself is going to do a little bit later. If you look at Book 1, Chapter 8, there's a great statement here from Candaules when he says that man's, I can't find the quote now, but a man's ears are less, a man's ears are duller agents of belief than his eyes. In other words, in order to believe truly that she is the most beautiful woman in the world, Candaules says Gyges has to see it for himself. And I think that's really interesting. I think what Herodotus is telling us here through Candaules is that we shouldn't believe everything that we're told, right? We shouldn't believe things just because we hear them. We need to check things out for ourselves. We need to verify things and see things with our own eyes if we are to believe them. And that's exactly what Herodotus does, right? He takes on this topic of war between the Persians and the Greeks, and he explores it by investigating it himself. He doesn't just follow the earlier story, right? He is going to pick this up and he's going to go and see things. And as you're going through Book 1, you should maybe try and pay attention to the places where Herodotus says, I have seen this with my own eyes, right? I have seen, he talks about some of the gifts that Croesus and others gave to the oracles or the Pythia at Delphi. And he says, I've seen this. And sometimes he says, and this is still here in my own times. And you see that especially when he gets on to talking about Babylon. And when he's describing Babylon, he says, that was the case in my day. Which I think is code for I've seen it myself. So I think this little story with Candaules and Gyges sets up where Herodotus is going with the rest of the tale, right? It sets up that his intent is to investigate things in his own way, to see things himself when at all possible. And this seems to me like the highest level of evidence that he can cite. There's another little bit in Book 1. It's the really famous story where Herodotus tells us about Arion riding on the back of a dolphin, right? And this is the one that people always say, oh, well, he's too credulous allowing all of this to be taken in. But he says he has seen the monument to it. And I think it's the act of seeing things that draws him in. And later in the work, in a later book, when he's talking about the Scythians off to the north, the barbarians to the north, and the Baldies who live beyond them again, he will accept things about the Scythians that he has seen himself, but he won't accept what they tell him about the Baldies because it's second-hand information, right? He wants to see it for himself, is the best case scenario. If that doesn't work, he wants to get his information from somebody who has seen something for himself. And then after that, he's very dubious about things that he doesn't have either in his own vision of it or someone else giving it to him. So I think placing this story at the very start of Book 1 is very significant. And I think this mode of operating is novel for Herodotus in terms of the study of the past. But I kind of think it fits with the intellectual tradition that he's working in ancient Greece. At another point in Book 1, Herodotus mentions Thales of Miletus, and that Thales had predicted an eclipse. Now, if you haven't come across Thales before, he's one of the earliest natural philosophers in Greece. What the natural philosophers were doing was they were investigating natural phenomenon. And instead of accepting that these things were simply the works of the gods, right? There was an eclipse because the gods decided that there would be an eclipse. Instead of accepting that, Thales and the other early philosophers wanted to investigate it themselves. They wanted to see if they could find a rational answer through observation, right? Through observation of nature. We see the same thing with the medical school on Kos, right? The Hippocrates and others. Instead of accepting old traditional explanations for illnesses, they want to, through observation, try to understand what is going on here. And I think Herodotus, one of the unique things about Herodotus is that he decides to do that about history. So instead of simply accepting one version of the past, for example, whether that's Homer or any other. Instead of accepting one version, he wants evidence, right? He wants to see things for himself. And I seem to have gone very quickly and finished most of what I wanted to say in 10 minutes. But I think the final thing that I wanted to add to that was that, you know, that's an important aspect of Herodotus in the ancient world. But I really think it's something that we can take a lot, that we can take for ourselves in the modern world. You know, we're in the last couple of weeks, we've heard an awful lot about fake news and topics like that. And I know when you see a news story on Facebook or when you hear something on the radio, I think what Herodotus would say is, you know, your ears are duller agents of belief than your eyes. Go and check things out for yourself. Look for evidence. Don't just accept what comes along. So I think that was really all I wanted to say about the Gyges story. I spoke very quickly, and I'm sorry about that. Are there any questions before I hand it over to Norman? No. Okay, well, in that case, I guess I will hand it over to Norman and let that go. But thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll take questions later on Slack if anyone wants.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Wadden. And yes, continue to ask questions, and we will have time at the end. And Professor Sandridge.
All right, first, let me bring a sound effect in for Patrick. There we go. That's a great fancy feature of the Google Hangout, and we should never pass up an opportunity to use it. So, okay, well, thank you so much, Gwen. Can you hear me now? Am I coming through okay? Yes, good. Okay, thanks. All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Norman Sandridge. I'm coming to you from just north of Washington, D.C., where I'm a professor at Howard University. Are there any Howard students in the chat room right now? You can say hello. Introduce yourselves if you would like. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight just briefly about, I hope to make this a bit of a conversation, is about the leader at the opposite end of Book One. So Patrick introduced us to Gyges and Candales, and I want to take us to really the final leader of Book One, Cyrus, so-called Cyrus II or Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia. In many ways, I think Cyrus is kind of the protagonist of or at least one of the protagonists of all of the history. He's kind of the character against which we can measure other leaders and see similar patterns in their lives. What I want to do for you tonight is talk primarily about the variations in Cyrus that we see across other Greek historiographers. I've shared a PDF document. You might have to scroll up in the chat. I've shared a document that sort of lays out some of the ways that I want to compare Cyrus in Herodotus's history to some other Greek historiographers, and just talk about not so much who the historical Cyrus was, but about the phenomenon of historiography. That is, how does someone write about their inquiry into the ancient world? And all the writers that we'll be looking at tonight wrote about Cyrus, 100 or more years after he lived. Just a quick word about Cyrus. He's easily one of the most important figures in the ancient world, and even in the ancient Greek and Roman world. 500 or 600 years after he lived, he's still a figure that prominent Greeks and Romans are looking back to as an example, either to be avoided or emulated. In fact, there's even an anecdote about Julius Caesar that he was reading about Cyrus shortly before he was murdered by senators on the Ides of March. And in reading about Cyrus, he had decided he didn't want to die the way Cyrus dies, not in Herodotus, but in one of the other authors, Xenophon. Cyrus gets a very peaceful and quiet death. And so when Caesar is asked what kind of death he wants, he said he wanted one that was sudden and unexpected, and he wants to distinguish himself from Cyrus in this regard. And of course, that's the death that he ended up getting. But all to say, Cyrus was someone that in the ancient world that people were regularly reflecting on. Okay, so to begin this, yes, the author Ezra loves Cyrus. Cyrus is a big figure in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. He's identified as a Messiah because he liberates Babylon, liberates the Jews from Babylon and enables them to build their own temple. So before we look at the document that I posted there, and thank you, Gwen, for posting it again, let me pose a question to the chat room. Let's speak in terms of a hypothetical here. If Herodotus were to encounter a new leader in the ancient world, someone he had never heard of or met before, what kinds of questions, what kind of inquiries would he bring to that leader? If he just said, "Hey, Herodotus, here's a new leader for you to investigate," what questions would he ask, do you think? How did he die? Very good. Who were your ancestors? Ask about a lineage. Are you lucky? What does it take to be happy? These are excellent. And while you're talking about this, I want to ask you to pull up the document that I shared, and you can perhaps toggle back and forth between the chat and in the document. So you see on the title of my document is "The Many Cyruses in Greek Historiography." And I begin with this quote from Herodotus. Herodotus is very good. His stories are not always the most plausible or certainly true, but he's very good at reminding us about the variety of stories that were around about a particular leader. So he says, this is in chapter 95, he says, "Our story must go on now to inquire who this Cyrus was, who took the empire from Croesus, and how it came about that the Persians became the leaders of all Asia. I will write my account according to the evidence of those Persians whose desire is not to make solemn miracles of all that concerns Cyrus, but to tell the very truth. But I know 3 other ways to tell the story of Cyrus." So Herodotus is acknowledging that for Cyrus, who lived 100 years before Herodotus, there is a great variation to the stories. And I want to just take you through. So you guys have started thinking already, developing almost an algorithm for the kinds of questions Herodotus would ask in encountering a leader. And I've laid out for you basically 5 questions that were, we might say, of regular interest to Greek historiographers. And the Greek historiographers I have in mind here are, of course, Herodotus, who wrote his history in around 440 BCE, and then there's another Greek named Ctesias who wrote a work called the Persica. It's a history of Persia. Ctesias was a court physician to the Persian king Artaxerxes, and in his time at the Persian court seems to have learned a lot, at least in terms of lore and legend. Learned a lot of Persian history. He wrote, as you see, a little bit later than Herodotus. And finally, a work that's very near and dear to my heart is called Xenophon's Education of Cyrus. This is written in the form of a biography, but you could think about it as kind of a how-to manual to being a great leader. In fact, one of the leading management theorists of the 20th century, a man named Peter Drucker, it's called The Education of Cyrus, still the greatest handbook of leadership in history. So it gives you a sense of that work. It's a really fascinating work. And in all 3 of these, it's amazing just how different the accounts of Cyrus are. And by pointing up these differences, I think we can see a lot in the way of the kind of story Herodotus wants to tell as distinct from the story that he might have told about, not only about Cyrus, but about any of these leaders. In other words, Herodotus has a certain understanding or certain belief in how human behavior works and how human fortunes work and how the fortunes of entire cities or entire nations work and evolve. And he's, as I say, by comparing these three different authors, we can kind of see that narrative emerging. And I'm just going to take you through it really briefly, and hopefully we can do some more chatting in the comment section as well. So first off is this question about who are Cyrus's parents. Several of you already mentioned that this would be one of the first things that Herodotus or probably anybody would ask about a leader when they encountered them in the ancient world. And it's a really, really important question to ancient audiences. First, it can mark the person as low or high born, and this distinction carries all sorts of moral and social judgments. Are you a good person? Are you a responsible person? Are you a restrained person? Are you a beautiful person? High birth was expected to connote this this kind of character. Just as it comes with a certain character expectation, you can think of high birth as coming with social pressures, as I say, especially for leaders who are expected to live up to the achievements of their ancestors. We're going to see throughout Herodotus many leaders who, when they accede to a throne, they're sort of faced with this burden of trying to match or even surpass what their ancestors had achieved. There's a great anecdote, by the way, about Alexander the Great, that he was so worried that his father, Philip of Macedon, was going to conquer all of the known world and leave nothing for him to conquer, because it was seen as so much more undignified to manage an empire than it was to acquire and establish one. People in these positions have tremendous pressure that they face. And finally, your birth can tell you a little bit about how the gods regard you. In other words, if you had good parents and good ancestors who maintained good relationships with the gods, you can be like the character of Telemachus in the Odyssey and inherit the favor of Athena from your father Odysseus. Similarly, as we've seen already in Herodotus, you can also inherit divine wrath, as Croesus does for what Gyges had done in the time of Candale. So Gyges gets to rise to the throne, but he also passes down a divine wrath to his descendant Croesus. So that's why it's so important to know someone's lineage. In the case of Cyrus's lineage, as we know from Herodotus, Cyrus is seen as the son of Mandane, the daughter of Astyages, the king of the Medes, and the Cambyses, king of Persia. Herodotus also talks about a folk tale of Cyrus being raised by a wild dog, which may remind you of the story of Romulus and Remus, attaching to Cyrus in a similar way. In Ctesias, believe it or not, Cyrus is the son of a man named Atridates, who is a thief, a common thief, and Argoste, a goat herd. And you may recall that the name of the shepherd who takes in Cyrus in Herodotus is called Mithridates, similar to Atridates. And then finally, in Xenophon, Cyrus is also the son of Mandane and Cambyses, but there's nothing to speak of in terms of a dream or, kind of that it was divinely ordained that Cyrus would rise to power over the Medes or anybody else. Cyrus comes to power in Herodotus, as we've seen already, because he's a natural leader and because it's fated that he come to power. Right, his grandfather has a dream about this. He plots with Harpagus, who's a victim of Astyages' cruelty, and they overthrow the king. And as I say, this happens according to dream. In Ctesias, Cyrus, amazingly, because he's low-born, he starts out as a palace servant, but he's so good and he's so loyal and faithful and good at playing the son that he eventually works his way into Astyages' good graces, wins him over, but then plots with a man named Ibares to overthrow Astyages. And in that scene, Cyrus's rise to power is also foretold by a dream, but it's a different dream, or it's a different person who has the dream. It's Cyrus's mother, the goat herd Argoste, who says she appeared to urinate so much that the mass of the urine became like the course of a large river which swamped the whole of Asia. And after this comes out, everybody has to keep it secret from Astyages. And in Xenophon, Cyrus is just a natural leader. This goes along with the idea of the education of Cyrus being more of a handbook to the reader than an attempt at any real historical account. Cyrus is just a natural leader that we all can apparently learn things from and emulate. He rises to power to the Median throne just because he's a great leader, and Astyages is totally on board with that. I'm going to skip ahead here. There are different versions of how to treat Astyages, or how Astyages dies, different versions of how Cyrus dies. He can die with his head soaked in blood. He can die on a military campaign, and he can also just live to an ripe old age, as he does in Xenophon. One final point that I think is really interesting that I want to wrap up has to do with Cyrus's character. We talked about this a little bit in my class today with the students about, is Cyrus a good leader or a bad leader? Is he a good person or a bad person? There's a lot of things that you could say. I think for Herodotus, one of the most important things to say about Cyrus as a leader is that, like many characters in Herodotus, even like Candaules, he comes to take his prosperity for granted, whether prosperity is having a beautiful wife, whether it's having a lot of riches, whether it's having a lot of military victories. Characters in Herodotus come to see themselves as invulnerable as a result of their prosperity, and that's why, of course, you can't declare someone truly happy until they die, because their earthly prosperity can drive them to be deluded. And in Herodotus, there's a great quote. I love this when he's talking about Cyrus's character on the eve of invading the Massagetae. He says, there were many great inducements to urge him on to war. First was his own birth. Notice the birth element there, in respect to which he appeared to be something more than human. So he's having delusions of grandeur at this point, and his good luck in his wars. So Cyrus has fallen prey to what psychologists call victory disease. He's won so many times that he just thinks he's always going to win. But notice the contrast here in Xenophon. When Cyrus is on his deathbed, this is 5c here, when Cyrus is on his deathbed, he says that he had a fear that was ever at my side, lest in time to come I might see or hear or experience something unpleasant. And it would not let me become, this fear would not let me become overweeningly proud or extravagantly happy. It's as if Xenophon has read his Herodotus and said, I don't want my Cyrus to be that deluded in that way. I want him, to be cautious his whole life, and that's what leads to him being, the most blessed of people. So the upshot of all this is, I think Herodotus's Cyrus is described in such a way, not necessarily because it's the truest account, even though that's what Herodotus says, but it's the account that is most true or most faithful to how Herodotus himself thinks the world works and thinks human behavior works, particularly the behavior of people who are in positions of apparent prosperity. And this is kind of a storyline. If you've ever read Greek tragedy, you know that a lot of characters in Greek tragedy have similar experiences. And so, as I say, I think Cyrus is consistent with that way of telling a story. But it's not, you don't have to tell the story that way. There were many other ways you could have described a Cyrus. So that's all that I have there. Gwen, are there any questions or interest? It looks like there's been a lot of talk about urine here. And here I thought we were going to go the whole evening without bringing up Trump. Ooh, there we go. All right.
Ouch.
Ouch. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
No. There was a question, I think you answered it in your conclusion. Does this mean that Herodotus's chosen portrayal of Cyrus's death was meant to elevate his stature as a historical figure?
To elevate his stature as a historical figure. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah. I guess that
it certainly makes him a high tragic figure, you know, up there with Oedipus gouging his eyes out, or Agamemnon being murdered by his wife in the bathtub, those kinds of things.
Right. I would agree with you there that the ending goes with, as you were saying, the way that Herodotus wants to see these characters and his own theme.
I presume she's wrapping up at this stage. Is anyone watching it on a different platform there?
Patrick, do your students have questions? Maybe. Southwestern, do you have any questions or comments you'd like to throw in? Do your students have questions?
I'm scrolling back up to see.
Southwestern, do you have any questions or comments you'd like to throw in?
That's actually. Oh, that's weird.
Any questions, Southwestern?
Questions, gang?
All right. Well, I noticed from the poll that I shared earlier, most people thought Cyrus was completely responsible for his fate, which is an interesting question we might want to take up in another discussion. That is, when so many things are foretold and the gods seem on some level to be controlling human fate, and there's this whole idea of a wheel of fortune, what role does an individual have in his or her fate? So far, everybody seems to be in the impression that they're pretty much in control.
All right. Thank you to, I think we're coming close to our time. Thank you to Professors Sandridge and Wadden for participating in our hangout and getting us some background information for how to think about Book 1. And the assignment for this week is to go to your small groups after you've finished reading Book 1. Go to your small groups and brainstorm some ideas about what interests you about the book. We focused on Cyrus and the story of Gyges tonight, but there are other interesting characters you might want to talk about and see how their characters align with the frameworks that we discussed tonight with Gyges and Cyrus. So there's a lot to be discussed. So you want to brainstorm some ideas, some topic possibilities, and then your small groups, your leaders will manage this, but half of you will write a little longer essay, and the other half will comment on it, and then we'll switch for Book 2. So watch for messages in your small group teams, and we'll hope to hear some of your student thoughts on next Tuesday after you've had some times to talk to each other on Slack and do a little more formal writing and talking to each other. All right. All right. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our professors and to all of our wonderful participants in the chat room, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. See you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.